Let's just give a few minutes for the people to join. All right, hopefully they'll come in. All right, so welcome to our third and final LOI panel of the day. And we have 4 presentations, which is great. So our first presenter is Ava Blake, who is a political science major, and they will present on the art of confessions within poetry, how they reflect society. Please welcome Ava Blake.
All right. Okay, I'm just trying to share my screen. It's gonna work. Can you guys see it?
We can't see it yet. You just click the green button there.
Okay. It's not wanting to work.
You can also email it to me, and then I can show it on my screen if that.
Okay, yeah.
All right, why don't we have someone go first?
Okay, sorry about that.
That's okay. We'll come back to Anna Mills. We'll welcome Anna Mills. Anna Mills is a journalism major, and they will be presenting on the power of voice and reclaiming your own. Thank you, Anna.
Yeah, of course. I'm gonna share my screen. I need to adjust it really quick. Just because it's a portion screen. But yes, hi everyone. My name's Anna Mills. I use she, her pronouns, and I am presenting the power of voice and reclaiming your own. Specifically, how poets with marginalized identities use poetry or creative expression as a platform to reclaim and empower themselves with just redefining who they are and those identities that they hold. Just for context of this inquiry is thinking back to why I love poetry in the first place, I didn't really resonate with neoclassic poets. I remember the first time I read a collection of poetry and was like, this is what I like, was Dennis Smith's collection, Don't Call Us Dead, and specifically how it took a modern form of poetry and juxtaposed pain and like associations of pain to oneself, but formatting it into this idea of beauty that created this sense of reclamation and empowerment. And I just thought that that was the reason why poetry existed for me, but I hadn't actually put it into words yet until I started this line of inquiry. To go on my thesis, I just want to quickly say that what inspired this I originally was going to talk about confessional poetry, but I was reading at the time this book called Emergent Strategies, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds by Adrienne Marie Brown, who's an author and poet. And they basically forced this direction of why I wanted to combine the elements of just media and representation and community with poetry and creative expression. But there's 2 parts of my thesis. The first part is first acknowledging that poets with marginalized identities have historically been represented in forms of media and literature through this lens of minstrelsy, stereotype, and normalized harmful characterizations and social implications. There's just an extent amount of representation through that lens when it comes to looking at specific marginalized identities in America. Or the United States. And then on the second part of that, I looked at how the platform of poetry and creative expression was able or created this opportunity for poets to reposition themselves and reclaim those identities. And then the outcome of that being this bridge building perspective that also fosters spaces for those shared identities to be illustrated more authentically and also give a more authentic voice to those underrepresented. And so what I found really, what kind of inspired this whole thing, so the quote on the left is from Adrienne Marie Brown's book. And when she was introducing herself as a writer and why she writes as a Black queer author, she mentioned that she's charged to write about the revolutions that she longs for, and that any writing she does, even if it isn't explicitly political, is still a transformative act, considering how she represents herself and how that is countering hegemonic literature. And so this kind of inspired the idea of how I started looking at poetry, and specifically for my line of inquiry. And when I was analyzing poets and their work, I was looking at what makes writing transformative and revolutionary, and also how does the platform of poetry specifically serve that transformation and what it accomplishes for poets. So looking at specific poetry, I was really fascinated with persona, the form persona. And persona to me comes in different ways. Persona can come in metaphorical embodiments. So that could be an object or an animal or another person. A classic example on the left is Maya Angelou's caged bird. And that kind of just gave me the standard, I think, idea of what persona is. But I also saw that persona, especially for the poets that I was analyzing, also showed in like the self-portrait I statements as well. And then what I noticed in my research about just writing in general and what it means to authentically represent yourself, there was this strong element of creating voice. And so I used 2 essays throughout most, like for the foundation of my analysis, one from Rebecca Hazelton, who talked about persona. She described persona as not writing what you know, but writing who you aren't. So kind of taking yourself away from that, or who you are, and going into another embodiment of something else. And that usually through like the metaphorical stance, so like caged bird, for example. And then Kathleen Blake Yancey was the essay that I used on voice and what it looks like for writers to claim their voice authentically. And she described voice as talking specifically about what and how a writer knows, about the capacity of a writer through voice that reveals the epistemology of a specific culture. And what was interesting was that when I looked at poets with marginalized identities who wanted to express themselves authentically, they kind of had this interesting paradox between this two of writing who you aren't, but also writing what you know. Because technically, so for them, what I found out was writing who they aren't was writing about themselves through what society hadn't understood yet. So the who they aren't is by means of societal perspective and social implications. But then they also juxtapose that self to writing who they are and what they know through their specific culture and epistemology of that culture. And so I kind of just really was examining and exploring the paradox of these two, of persona and voice, and how it created this interesting just way that poets were able to express themselves. And then so I used persona as the form to look at how like figurative language was able to represent the poets, but I looked specifically when analyzing their poetry at voice conceptions. And so this quote comes from Yancey's essay, and it talks about, it gives these list of conceptions that voice shows up in writing, depending on what they're writing about and how they write about it. And so this is how writers develop a voice to enlighten readers and writers of what they're claiming. And in this instance, like the reclaiming of themselves. And so voice for these poets shows up as a reference for truth and for self. It shows up as a reference for human presence or conflicting selves, a source of resonance. It could show up as appropriations or approximations, as an opportunity for discourse, talking about what the poet or the poetry actually means, or points of critique or myth. And so I use this as the foundation for how I was understanding poetry on a voice conception level and how that worked with the form of persona. And I'll show examples specifically, but the main 3 poets that I used in my line of inquiry were Ocean Vuong's Not Even This, Dennis Smith's The 17-Year-Old in the Gay Bar, and then Audre Lorde's Cole. And these had 3 different takes on persona in my definition, I guess. Dennis Smith on the left here was more of the self-portrait persona of a gay man in a gay bar. Ocean Vuong on the top was a more spoken I self-exploration piece. And then Audre Lorde's was a more standard metaphoric persona of Cole. And so I used these 3 different examples and then talked about the purpose and just contextually a social constructivist view, and then looked at the voice conceptions. And so to show what that looked like, I will use Dennis Smith's example. So this is the first stanza of The 17-Year-Old in the Gay Bar. And I noticed 4 strong voice conceptions. The first one being the process of writing. And what that means is the act of writing about something specific to this topic itself has a voice in its own. So Dana Smith having this introspective narrative of being a 17-year-old in a gay bar and what it's like to find a sense of belonging, a sense of community, despite like this conflicting narrative that comes with having a queer identity. So that was the first one I instantly noticed. The second one was from the first line. So reference for the truth of self and human presence. When we look at the first line, this gin heavy heaven, less ground to think gay and mean we. It just opens this statement of acknowledgement of space and human presence for queer folk, especially taking into consideration the setting of a gay bar. Like knowing what gay bars mean for the LGBTQ community and the safe havens it creates. And so there was that strong, just from the setting alone, but the opening statement, the rest of this poem also has different elements of that. I don't have enough time to talk about it. It just really sets this voice of human presence and establishing that. And then the third one is reference for conflicting self. This one is more, if you think about it contextually. So if there's the line, I look to Christ, I look to every mouth on the dance floor. I order a whiskey Coke, name it the blood of my new savior, he is just. Although this poem doesn't necessarily feel entirely conflicted, I think it comes from more of a place of like finding a sense of belonging. There's those figurative elements from the persona form that have this voice of conflicting self. If we look at religious associations and then also what it's like to be queer within those communities, the feeling of being chastised from Christianity and different examples like that. And then the last one is a source of resonance. I feel like the whole poem itself was just kind of an ode to the queer community that Dana Smith was creating with the scene setting of the gay bar, but also having this authentic voice come from this introspection of feeling empowered within your gay identity and being in a space where that's supportive. Also thinking about the juxtaposition between different stereotypes that come with being queer and how he addresses that, or how they address that, and kind of counteract that with this sense of empowerment that comes through the narrative. And then, so what I noticed about all of this, basically at the end, was that writing what society doesn't know allows art to be essential in revolution. And this goes back to what Adrienne Marie Brown was stating in her piece, just talking about what she accomplishes as a writer when writing about herself. And so the effective persona and voice for these marginalized poets, what it does is it builds perspective and understandings of identity that impacts the way people can self-express. They are not seeing the narrative of their identity through this violent and harmful characterization, but they're seeing it in an authentic and new light that feels authentic to them. And then what that also does is challenges societal views. So people who necessarily don't have those identities are able to see and build perspective on someone else in a new light that's not under hegemonic literature. What it also does is demand space and advocates for a voice that marginalized writers want for them in their communities. So just like if we look at the first line in Dennis Smith's poem, to think gay and mean we, it's just that demanding that they are being heard that really just, I think, surfaces through the poets and their work, and like is a source of resonance for the communities that they belong to. And then in general, language articulates knowing. When we look at just how language is used in academia, it is primarily how we create knowledge. And so this creative expression specifically, so looking at how poetry accomplishes challenging hegemonic language narratives that is constantly encoded and supported in most academic settings. Creative expression takes this new outlet and look that can give these poets ownership in what they want to write about. And then, so I think this quote on the right really kind of just sets the purpose for why this is really important. Bell Hooks in their self-love and self-help book, All About Love, which I highly recommend if you want to just feel good about yourself, read the book. She says, when we can see ourselves as we truly are and accept ourselves, we build the necessary foundation for self-love. And what I think that's speaking to is that for many people who hold marginalized identities, they haven't had much control in the way that they are represented in media or language or literature. And so what creative expression does is it challenges that hegemonic language. And once that's challenged and they are able to feel authentically seen and heard, that's when they can start building the foundation of self-love that they deserve and have the right to have. And then hence why the revolutionary aspect comes into it. And then how this relates to me specifically is that I mean, this is why I love poetry. I'm starting to challenge in my own writing of what society doesn't know by creating my voice in my own terms in my writing, and not what society or standard literature has taught me or what I've been exposed to that I feel I need to replicate. I'm starting to represent the community I belong to and reclaim myself by writing about things that no one knows about me and feeling empowered when I create that. Some examples is I was a storyteller at the UO Intertwined storytelling event. And I talked about what it was like having, and through a like poetic approach, talked about just my journey with mental illness and what that was like. And that was the first time I was openly expressive about it, but creative expression and poetry allowed me to feel authentic in that space and convey myself like I felt like I had never done before. And more of my poetry just personally is now me exploring aspects of life and community that I'm really familiar with, but have never felt represented. And so having that, I've been gaining this kind of empowerment to feel like my story is actually being heard. And it's all because of this line of inquiry and the conceptions of voice and just figurative language that has taught me how to do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks. That was great. Fantastic. All right. Up next, we have Madeline Fehlman, who is a psychology major and will be presenting her paper, Trauma as Elegy. Please welcome Madeline.
Okay, let me try to share this. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on here. There we go. Okay. Okay, can everybody, hold on, I can't see you, so I can't see if you're responding. 1 second. Okay, can everybody see okay? Yes, okay, good. Perfect. So, hello, my name is Madeline, and I did my line of inquiry titled Trauma. Hold on, I'm just gonna have to restart because this technology is not my friend. Okay, I think that's good. Okay, starting over. Hello, my name is Madeline Fehlman, and I will be presenting my line of inquiry titled Trauma as Elegy. My initial exploration kind of centered around this question of how poets write about their own specific experiences in ways that evoke feelings in everyone else. That is kind of what impresses me most about poetry, is that in so few words, you can experience the feeling that the poet may have also felt, and walk away from that being affected by something that you might not even know about firsthand. And that is what I have been trying to accomplish in my own poetry, as I've been trying to write about my father's abandonment of my family. Initially, I thought that I would just focus on any poetry about trauma, but then I kind of realized through research that elegy was the form that was at the center of all of these kinds of poems. So I turned my focus towards the evolution of the elegiac form through time, and to see what all these poems that were so effective had in common. Oop, I already messed up my technology. Okay, so according to poets.org, traditional elegy is consistent of 3 separate parts. This was a time when poets were often rich white people who went to church on a regular basis. And so a lot of the imagery was relating to nature and heaven and envisioning their deceased loved one among the stars with the angels. And in this form, it would begin kind of wistful, you know, oh, I'm going to miss you. And then honoring their loved one and admiring them, and then ending with some sort of peaceful vision, like the stars above in heaven. And I found this to be most prevalent in Yeats's poem, When You Are Old. And this was conveniently divided up into 3 stanzas that mentioned each thing. And in the first one, you see sorrow expressed in that diction. We have old and gray, shadows deep. The second stanza, admiration, how many loved your moments of glad grace. The last stanza, his face amid a crowd of stars. So this kind of nature imagery was very common in many of the traditional elegies that I looked at in my paper, and some of them more than others, but they all eventually at one point turned back to the natural world as a symbol or metaphor for their grief. And looking at my own poetry in comparison, I have not, nor do I ever wish to at this point in my life, envision my father at peace among the stars. He's not dead, but I don't intend to do that in my poetry at this point where I am. What I want to do is rage and curse and tell the world how mad I am. And by some miracle, that is exactly what modern elegies do. So as described by Jahan Ramazani, he describes modern elegy as portraying this melancholic mourning, which consists of uglier emotions that one feels during grief, not just the wistful sadness, but the, you know, anger and the hatred for the person for leaving you. And he argues that traditional elegies embodied normative mourning, which is this kind of socially acceptable sadness that was more elegant and lyrical for poetry. But modern elegies focused on these less attractive emotions, these less, you know, appropriate thoughts and feelings that people had when dealing with loss and death. And sometimes it would even involve insulting the person who died or using very shocking language. And the strongest example, in my opinion, is Sylvia Plath's poem Daddy, and you can laugh at the irony, but it really does embody the modern elegy. She wrote this poem about her father who died when she was a child and clearly is upset. And she completely breaks the traditional form. She's not sorrowful, she's angry. She doesn't admire her father, she's insulting him. And she does not feel consoled or at peace at the end. She's tired, she's through, like it says. And another interesting aspect of this poem that really stuck out to me was the fact that she incorporated a lot of imagery associated with the Holocaust. There were many more examples in the rest of her poem. But basically, instead of portraying nature in relation to her father, she's portraying one of the most horrible atrocities in human history. She's basically associating her father with Hitler. So I thought that that must be what makes this effective, this shock value. But I realized that it likely has more to do with the fact that readers saw their like bad feelings reflected back at them through her poetry. They felt like they weren't alone in their emotions through this tumultuous time of grieving. And this is likely true for all of the modern elegies, but especially the ones that I focused on. They all kind of take this focus from the person who died and everything that was great about them to kind of the struggle that the person who's mourning them is experiencing and their own emotions and behaviors, instead of directly mourning the other person. And in my own writing, I had undergone this shift, though not in poetry, but I had gone from writing angrily in my journal to writing elegantly in my poetry in a more lyrical and acceptable way. And this shift is really prevalent in contemporary elegies because as a whole, they all address forms of trauma or the loss of innocence or the self. And they even mourn what could have been. I know a lot of poets that I researched for my essay were mothers who wrote about miscarriages and struggles with infertility. And that was one of the one of the strongest trends that I noticed across contemporary elegies. And I also noticed that these elegies face the return of the nature imagery that kind of disappeared during the modern era. And you can see this most clearly out of the poems that I looked at in Gregory Orr's poem, Gathering the Bones Together. His experience was very unique in that he accidentally shot and killed his brother when he was 12. So that is a traumatic experience, obviously. And the way that he writes about this poem, or writes about his brother, focuses more on his own experiences, but in a very poetic way that kind of reflects the diction and imagery of traditional elegies. So the dedication is even poetic here. When all the rooms of the house fill with smoke, it's not enough to say an angel is sleeping on the chimney. Like that, not even just like, oh, for my brother, like a whole thing. And that is what really moved me about this poem, because there were lots of instances like that where describing, like in this case, the smoke conveys like the suffocating feeling that one might feel when struggling with loss. And even here, his bones, he felt like his bones were wrenched from his body. And so this poem very strongly focuses on his own feelings surrounding the death of his brother rather than who his brother was when he was alive. And the natural imagery here, this example does not have a lot of it, but there's a lot throughout the poem that incorporate nature. One of my favorite lines is he equates snails. He says, snails are little death swans. And I'm like, what is that? That's genius. I love it. So that really stuck out to me. And basically the takeaway here for contemporary elegies is that the subject of the poem is no longer the person who passed away, but the person who is mourning them. And I thought that the return of nature imagery in particular was fascinating, because if it was what made traditional elegies successful, why did it leave in the first place? And then if modern elegies were doing okay without it, why did it come back? And I did a lot more analysis of this, and I realized that ultimately it's the landscape that's important, not just the landscape painted in the poem, but the landscape that the poet is in at the time of writing. So incorporating universal symbols into your own experience is what connects the reader to your poem. So like I said, the traditional poets were all churchgoers, and they all, wanted to honor the dead. So that's probably why there was more of a strict form for elegy. It had the sorrow, admiration, consolation, because that was kind of the acceptable path of grieving. But for modern poets, and especially Sylvia Plath, who was a part of the confessionalism era, that whole era was about breaking the molds and doing things that people haven't done before. So the fact that that whole time period, people were looking for something new, it makes sense that like Plath would incorporate such interesting imagery into her poetry, because it spoke more strongly to the readers. And now in contemporary poems, elegies have expanded to include not just deceased loved ones, but also traumatic experiences that happen to the individual, that the individual survives. And I think that falls in line with the decreasing stigmatization of mental health and the acceptance in the literary world of people's unique experiences and the willingness to write about them. They're not getting like shamed for it. They're not, it's not inappropriate to publish it. So I think that by realizing, like kind of going with the times, like poets realize like people want to feel their own emotions in my writing. So then they take the symbols and experiences that they have and they bring them together in a way that speaks to the reader. And often what human beings go through is not unique. Everyone experiences these different emotions at one way or another at one point in life. And while the poem might be about one person's specific story, it usually involves the emotions that are felt by all of humankind. And that's really what the takeaway for me was, in terms of writing in a way that speaks to the reader while also maintaining the integrity of your own experiences. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Madeline. Okay, next up, we have Andrew Barron. Andrew, will be presenting a paper titled Queer Violence, the Disembodied Homosexual Persona Affected by the Spiritual and Existential. Please welcome Andrew.
Hello, let's share my screen. Let's see. Sorry. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yep.
Hopefully, awesome. Okay. Yeah, not too sure why I did an opening, but this is who I am. I'm Andrew. I am a Mexican-American poet. And I guess I'll just start. How do I, okay, so this is, before I begin, this is self-inflicted queer violence, the disembodied homosexual persona affected by the spiritual and existential, or otherwise, if you were to Google my existential crises, my whole life, it would be abridged as, or suddenly the world looks bleak after Catholic school and age-old traditions. I'm unsure of how my life will look like. Look how existential I am at 21. So before I began going into my line of inquiry, I used to pray for acceptance. I prayed for understanding. I grew into the shoes of queer fear, the inherited anxiety of not being accepted by my parents or my family, the church, friends, and our God. I was very existential at a very young age. And I started to develop a rebellious form of prayer, praying for sex, to be noticed, to be better looking. But I believe poets have seen some truth to religion, to God, to the art of faith, and through homoerotic poetry, I feel tethered to God. Moving on. The spirit of confessional writing has grown with culture. The most profound and provoking contemporary writing has been birthed from the consciousness of queer poets, subverting the sullen themes often explored in existentialism and spirituality through a dramatic re-envisioning of queerness. Queer poetry, through its moody and nasty desire, often grounds its violence with lush, disembodied personas. I began to believe, or not believe, but wonder how I and other queer poets are affected by existentialism and spirituality, although released through the physicality of sex and disembodiment. And I don't have an answer to this, but I have a way of seeing into it, because in this way, religion and existentialism affect the way in which queerness is embodied through poetry, perpetuated by the oppression and moralistic division of Christianity, while subverted through queer confessional art as religion. And if there's one familiar trait I've been left with, it's storytelling. It seared into my skin at birth. I was basically branded. My family tells stories like no other, and I tell them now too because I have to, and it's part of my own survival. And the unknown is always telling me I have to string these words along. So this is what I have to give. It's not much, but it's enough to reckon my proximity with sex and the church, losing myself and picking up the pieces and putting them back in all the wrong places and learning to be okay with that. And the poet Christopher Soto, otherwise known as Loma, does it best. These are my lessons on masochism and vulnerability. So in their poems, Soto engages with themes of intimacy, trauma, and identity. Soto has said, I grew up Catholic. I always thought Jesus was extremely radical, political. He was born homeless, hung out with sex workers. He was an anti-capitalist and was crucified by the state. I think my dream world is very parallel with some Catholic ideologies. I believe in the redistribution of resources and helping those who are in need of help. I appreciate Loma's subversion of religion and spirituality, toying with doctored characters from the Bible to reinstate a form of control in their own autonomy of their body and identity. Their depiction of queer life is sometimes depicted quite graphically, and in that way is nightmares for some, but it's music to my ears because their lyricism allows me to reject a very real and hypothetical other and write about my own innate sexual prowess that cannot be written unlike anyone other than my own fingers to pen to words. Loma has said, my poems are like a good choking, a good spanking. They want to be bound and gagged and told what to do. There is a pleasure that my poems derive from being under such control, from having trauma recalled and then stripped of its agency. Similar to Loma, I strive for masochism. My poetry can be pornographic, overwhelming, yet serene and pastoral, yet always leaving off a sense of ecstasy. My poetry and its own resonance is a type of control and freedom that usually feels fleeting. There's my family, but I had to go through the traditional customs for them. And I've never read the Bible, save for the book of Revelations, because I was obsessed with the melodramatic re-envisioning of the end of the world. And this is what compels me to Ocean Vuong's writing. It's evocative, it's breathtaking, it's original, it's soulful and inherently religious. He has taught me lessons on softness and violence. Vuong accomplishes a world within a poem through his creativity, making an entire soundscape within his poetry through contemporary means by mentioning musical artists such as Lil Peep, reading Diddy in on a train somewhere in Indiana, the scripted pauses and laughter, glasses clinking. Ocean Vuong says, queerness is no longer a whisper, but is both a declaration and a celebration at once. Ocean Vuong intersects Buddhist principles with the American working class and majority Catholic and Christian mindset of sin, abstinence, and purity as challenged and set ablaze in the space of his lyric poems. Through the Buddhist lens, Vuong emphasizes the way in which the past works in and out of itself to create a reflection for us. This is further explored in the bodies reflected in his work, in a queered sense refracted from the spiritual, completely deconstructing a queer writer's process from a disembodied religious sense. He says, it can be easy to put something that is broken back together, but it is incredibly difficult to expound on all the violence that accumulated into the breaking. Queerness is vital to the innovation because it operates as a space where permission is offered as a change. And this is a very radical idea in American thinking. We emphasize stability as progress, but queerness rejects that and offers a wild and chaotic yet expansive lesson in what it is possible. The possibility of queerness rejecting the notions of an entwined religious confounded Judeo-Christian system in the US, Vuong enlightens my sense of self. I feel reborn every time I read his words. I feel revolutionary, philosophical even. There's a direct action in reading his work by that of spirituality, politics, and self-doubt. As seen through the existential, Vuong is a poetic revolutionary. Joshua Jennifer Espinoza is a revelation. I feel floaty when I read her work. She is pastoral desert landscapes, discussing her identity as a trans woman, but also in the ways in which her family dynamics has changed. I cradle her words in my arms just to make sure they are safe and sound with me forever, because Espinoza's words feel like home. When I read her work, it feels like I never left home. She writes that we have to remain in a chaotic state to survive. We have to scream in pain from the loneliness and inward bending bones hell-bent on taking us out from the inside. Her poetry is both a war cry and a white flag. It's a cry for help, a declaration of self-love, and mostly proof of living despite the world collapsing in on itself because of who you are. And I would be remiss if I didn't include a piece of creative nonfiction that I wrote because of her work. I am queer whether or not I tell some other religious family members that I am not, that I am, that I accept sin, that I am sin. And I'll find them on the other side someday, and hopefully we'll be floating in the same black abyss we see when we sleep. Under the same moon, between the palms that sway in the Santa winds, the smog that oftentimes clouds above the skyline, the freeways that snake like veins, the valleys that burn, the beaches crowded to the brim with sweaty bodies, and all the world's eyes looking upward at the Hollywood sign in awe. Somewhere between the static and blur, I am screaming, I am queer, over and over again. Muso Takahashi, my inspiration. All the eroticism in the world couldn't give me what Takahashi has written. His work is untouchable, immoral, pastoral, and deliciously imaginative. Here is a simple recipe for guidance on the right side of the screen in the cheekiest and most sincere way possible. Takahashi empathizes with the plight of Jesus Christ, the Savior, finding comfortability in the active resistance of God's Son that God's Son embodies, while at the same time still feeling and being lonely. Takahashi travels into a church on Christmas and of him, take me in, take me in, take me in. Because of Takahashi, I started writing my own poetry. I felt a sense of belonging. I wasn't a horny deviant. I was just experiencing sex in the most spiritual way possible, through words, through pastoral techniques, graphically, subtly. I was so scared of what I wanted to write, but Takahashi made it clear that language empowers. My writing is masochistic and estranged, bridging the isolation of existentialism and the otherworldliness of spirituality with dismembered bodies and the erotic, emphasizing a direct link to art as a religion. Religion as sensual, queerness as disfigured yet beautiful, and desire through religious subversion. The queered experience is infinite and ever-changing through the lens of race, gender, and time. Spirituality has affected them each, varying the ways in which they subvert it, succumb to it, become submissive to the iconery of Christ or God, or the body in which they question each cell that lies like a chessboard across our bodies. What I mean to say is the body of my works are possible because of the collection of voices I've kept close to me along my journey of writing poetry. Like them all, writing is painful, it's tragic, sometimes incendiary, but the words need to be written. My voice is needed. Keeping the intensity of my voice alive is what allows me to breathe each morning. My lungs grow lighter with each poem. I want to leave these words I've strung from in between my ribs where a desolate garden lays with a memory of remembrance. The queers who've lived 1,000 more lives than I ever will, and the queers writing postcards for their lovers today, tonight, tomorrow, still writing in between the calendar holidays we don't pay attention to anymore. These words have been written, and I'm looking forward to writing more. So the way in which my line of being queer relates to my own work as a writer, to wrap it up, is spirituality, existentialism, confessionalism, vulnerability. My LOI is a direct mirror to my own work. It's pastoral yet erotic and bridging classical traditionalism with a contemporary reimagining, as well as a search for the self continuously. It is contemporary yet sexy. I never want to lose sight of my lust or eventual love, and will never lean into the fear that I can't bridge both my spirituality with my identity. Writing insights on vulnerability, if I were to give any insight from this LOI that I'm so thankful that I was able to do. Nobody knows that this is the truth, so write it, both your truth in your writings analytically and your own poetry. Balance your vulnerability by mending it. Give yourself space to breathe. Be observant, voyeuristic, and all-consuming. There is no end to this line of inquiry because there is no end. It is a continuous work of a collection of works from contemporary poets that are still learning to mend themselves together through the spiritual and existential. And hopefully there isn't an end to that because it just brings content and it brings joy and it brings pain, and that's the things that we need to live. And that is the end of my line of inquiry. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Andrew. That was great. You also have the very colorful visual production here.
Thank you. I'm trying to stop share. There we go.
Ava, can you share your screen now, or do I need to?
Let me check.
Oh, there it is.
Okay, awesome.
All right, so you just get your project's titled "The Art of Confessions Within Poetry: How They Reflect Society."
Yep.
Go ahead, Ava.
All right, awesome. So yeah, I'm talking about confessional poetry and how it moves with us through society. Okay, so brief history of confessional poetry. It started gaining a lot of traction in the 1960s, and it complemented a lot of social movements at the time. One of the ones that we can see this the easiest with is the feminist movement, which started as like a lot of book clubs that were about teaching biology, because a lot of women wanted to know if there was inherent biological differences between men and women. They quickly moved to being about sharing personal experience and how that was a liberating feeling that made it so they could move on to like bigger issues of social justice, because all of the books about biology were written by men. So they were pretty sexist, but it shows us that social movements have a deep, intimate relationship with literature, and it brings a lot of power. So
Ava, do you have a slide that you're trying to show us?
Can you see
we
that?
See like the desktop, I think.
You can just stop sharing and then reshare. Yeah, that should work.
Okay. Is it showing the?
It's still your desktop. When it comes up for sharing screen options, maybe pick like if it's PowerPoint, choose that instead of desktop. That might help.
I can try to share mine, Ava. Hold on. Let me see.
Okay.
All right, so let me all right, here we are. Are we on this slide or another next one?
I was going to move to the next one.
Okay.
So what confessionals mean to me is I grew up Catholic, and so it was a big part of my life. We went to confessional every couple of months, and for some reason when I was a kid, I couldn't bring myself to tell the truth about the sin, so I'd be lying every time I went in there, but I was really serious about the penance that the priest gave me, and I would make sure I would do all the prayers and do everything, so it was a lie, but it had real consequences, and I was very committed to doing that for kind of no reason. But it definitely influenced the way I write poetry, and it just subconsciously made me kind of create these stories that break norms, which I can definitely see in my poetry. So one of the examples is Mental Mommy by Liam Rector. Home from school at 6 years old, first grade, an uncle there to tell me mommy gone, mommy not coming back anytime soon, Liam. Mommy had to go to mental hospital, nervous breakdown. Years later, mommy, when she gets out of mental, often says, if you're a bad boy for me, Liam, you're going to send me back into mental hospital, like you did the first time. At 13, I find out mom had been doing years in a federal prison at the time for stealing. So no mental hospital for mommy, breakdown ours alone, I was on my own. So from this, we can see the use of suspense, which is in a lot of confessional poems. The diction shows that the speaker is unreliable because he's very young. The line breaks are really sudden, which creates a kind of clunkiness that we don't know what's going to happen next. And the confession starts in the fourth stanza, leads into the fifth. And it's interesting because a lot of times confessional poems are in the first person, but it wasn't the speaker's confession. It was something that he was finding out, and it was like we were walking with him while he was finding it out. There's a lot of breaking of norms, not just because it's not in first person, which we expect from this kind of poem, but it also shows a relationship filled with love and abuse for the mom, and we don't know how to feel about it. You know, when we hear about a mother stealing, is it for the kid? Is it for their own selfish need? Are they abandoning the kid? You know, we also get a sense of how, you know, there's bigger implications of women and their role in society, how we expect women to be caretakers without thinking of the economic consequences that we would have without that. So there's a lot of bigger pictures with how we can use confessional poetry because we get so many perspectives, and we can see how society really views things, and we can use them to think deeper. So perceptions are more than just an individual bias, which is why we should really care about this subject. There's an inherent political nature in all of our societal influence and cultures. So two of the ways we can see how perception directly influences politics is with Immanuel Kant looking at democratic peace theory, and also Brent V. Benson and Joshua D. Clinton when they show how perceptions change allies in the international market. So for democratic peace theory, it's how democratic states are highly unlikely to go to war with other democratic states. For this, definitions really matter. So a democratic state is a state that has fair and free elections, and they've gone through at least 3 cycles. It's important that they've gone through that and that they're fully matured, because if there's a coup and a state becomes democratic, it's actually more likely to be violent, and it's going to have hyper violence because it's not mature. So that really matters within that theory. Perceptions matter because we can't just look at institutional constraints. So we can't look at how it's just a liberal democracy, but we have to be able to look at how liberal it is in comparison to other states and their perception of it. So one example is Britain's perspective during the Civil War. So at first they were in favor of the South because they had more trade, and they saw both sides as fairly equal. They just wanted to see where they could trade more. That was until there was a huge statement of how the North was for freeing slaves. And then it became a moral issue. It wasn't about just two American sides, it was a moral issue. And because of that, they had to change their whole perspective, because their citizens couldn't allow themselves to support the South. So there's a lot of democratic, like how liberal different states are, and how that really warps how we view things, and how we view other states is a lot of times such a cultural view that we don't think deeply about it. So it's important to be able to look at ethnicities and cultures in the context of literature, where we're writing about it in a very honest way. So in a broader kind of way in the international stage, so it's not just with kind of a lower level of domestic politics, we look at allies not with absolute power. So it's not just about who's kind of the biggest and the baddest. It's not about hegemonic powers. It's actually about perceived reliability. So we see balancing, which would be going against big hegemonic powers, like in the example of World War I. We see that, but sometimes we should be seeing buck passing, and they get mixed up. So we can see the kind of wrong thing that people are doing, and it's all based on perception. This is really important because we get into issues where when there's a lack of outsider perception and there's a lack of critical thinking, people are fast to make rash decisions. We see this in Russia in World War II, excuse me. And then we also saw this with Japan when the oil was cut off. Also, the US refusing to stop the oil cutoff that led to the Pacific War because of the ability to appear tough when it was all an accident. So there's a lot of accidents that go into like maintaining perceptions that lead to these really catastrophic events. Poetry can help us look at these theories because it allows critical thinking about norms instead of having a moment of groupthink. We can allow different types of literature that specifically break norms, like confessionalist poetry, and we can use it in a way that it has bigger implications. It leads to larger issues in society, and we can use it to kind of tackle issues that are really intimidating, like politics.
All right, that's the end. Cool. Well, thank you so much, Ava. Glad we could get that to work. Great. So I think we have two attendees here. So if you have questions, you can put it in the chat and be happy to read it out. Yeah, I guess one question I have is what surprised you about your LOI? Like, what did you discover that you did not expect in the whole research process? Because this was a two-term sort of thing, right? So you had a lot of time to sit with the material. So what surprised you that you discovered? And what we can start with Anna.
Yeah. Well, originally, I was really fascinated with the form of persona in general. And when I was talking about it in like the standard form of like taking the embodiment of something, like coal, for example, with Audre Lorde's example, I was just really fascinated at the different ways that I could create an interpretation of how persona form showed up for different poets. So like I talked about how it showed up in self-portrait and I statement pieces, and kind of how it wasn't you didn't have to, and I guess the dimensions of what that looked like for specific poets. So poets who needed more room to explore themselves and their identity, persona looked different, and how that was conveyed. So like through that personal I piece, but how for other poets it was different in that more embodiment of something else. And so it's just really interesting seeing the different ways that that form kind of adapted in my own personal understanding.
Cool. What about you, Madeline?
I think for me, I think the whole thing was very surprising to me because I hadn't ever done any formal research on poetry. I've never been, invested in learning about poetry. I've always just kind of like written it for the sake of writing poetry. And so I think to like learn that one form has such a deep like history and changed so much, like that makes me wonder, like, well, what about all the other forms of poetry? Like, what's going on here? So I think just like learning about the depth behind these forms, you learn them in school and you're like, yeah, who uses that, but then you see that it's actually like a solid component of the poetry world. And I thought that was probably the most interesting thing for me to learn about.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's also weird, like how things come back, like you were saying, the nature is coming back into the poems and just seeing the cycle happen. So cool. What about you, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a loaded question. I stayed with the same question I had all the way through. I looked at my own writing and I was like, what do I want to write about? I wanted to write about other writers, other queer writers who were also just kind of writing about snapshots of their own body, the hands, limbs, people who were really just kind of cutting themselves off and isolating their body parts to their identity, to their cultural world around them. And I found that through Ocean Vuong specifically. I mean, I was so afraid. I mean, not afraid, but I personally did not enjoy Ocean Vuong's work. I mean, maybe a year or two ago until just recently. And I think it was because I was afraid of what I really, truly wanted to write about. So when I dug into confessionalism and vulnerability and the strengths of queer writers and their bodies and eroticism, it came down to just stripping away my fear and the baggage and really applying myself to wanting to be the writer that I can be.
So you weren't ready for Ocean Vuong yet when you first, but now you have changed. That's pretty cool.
He's the master.
Awesome. Yeah, he came here a couple years ago actually. So maybe he'll come again. Ava, how did what surprised you about your process here?
I think just how much you can get out of a poem when you're looking at such a specific lens. Like when you're focusing on one topic, you can really like delve into so many different meanings. Because I think annotating poems is something that for me is always really intimidating. I'm always like, oh, like what if I say the wrong thing? But I was surprised with when you get really specific, you can actually get so much more out of it, and you can enjoy poems that normally wouldn't appeal to you at all.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've had like, what's it called, epiphany moments where like I fully could understand a poem and it just like created a whole nother experience. It was really cool.
Yeah, you need that. Depends on what lens you're using, that it might unlock something. So cool. Well, Harrison actually has a question. Let me read that. Harrison has a question for Andrew. Andrew mentioned that, and maybe for everybody, Andrew mentioned that the presentation LOI can never really end. How does everyone else feel? Are you looking to move forward with your research, continue to apply it to your own life and writing? What is the next step? Yeah, this panel will end eventually, but yeah, the process of research, the process of where you are in your sort of investigation here. What do you think? And maybe Andrew, you could just talk about, because you're the one that kind of brought it up.
I mean, yeah, I'll start and anybody can jump in at any time. I don't know. I mean, I would say my line of inquiry is very, I took a very personal approach to it as well as analytical. So I was specifically looking at Latino poets such as Christopher Soto and Joshua Jennifer Espinoza, and then yeah, gender identity. I was talking a lot about home and being away from Los Angeles. I'm going on maybe year 4 now next year. So there's a lot in the line of inquiry that I just want to return to, just the different sections on lessons on vulnerability or softness or masochism. I just kind of dropped it into chapters basically, and that's what I kind of like to do with my poetry, is almost make them into chapters of a larger scale. And for me, anytime soon, and I don't want to check it anytime soon. It'll take some time to go back to the LOI and look through it. But I will say maybe the next step is making prompts. I think we made prompts in class, or I made a prompt in class about disfiguring yourself. Find 10 ways to really just like chop up your body or something, and then make a pastoral or erotic sensibility to it. 10 steps, 10 reasons why, 10 ways that you do it, and then make a poem out of it. So that's been fun. So maybe the next step is just, I don't know, writing more.
Always good. Anna, what's next steps for you for the project?
Yeah, I wish I could have, like, the 15-page paper was like really jarring for me, but as I was writing, I was like, I need at least 30 pages because there was so much to the conversation that I wanted to talk about. I focused more of my line of inquiry on like the personal relationship from the writer and the reader and what that could create for just people who identified with the poet on specific identities and people who didn't. And I came across so many. I was also, as an ethnic studies major, I kind of just always have these conversations around like race and just societal perceptions and social implications and media as well. And so representation is a huge thing for me as a writer and as a journalist as well. And I came across so many resources that talked about like what poetry does for like POC youth and communities, and specifically like what workshop settings and teaching them what creative expression looks like and how they can express themselves was like something very much relevant to the research I was doing, but didn't have enough space or time to do so. And so I think I'm gonna, especially within my major, I wanna keep exploring and intersect my two studies of ethnic studies and creative writing on how like art specifically creates a platform of revolution where people can just feel authentic in communities and feel represented. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm heading now.
Cool. Yeah, you should look into the Watts Writers Workshop as well, which I think would be, that's like one of the original writers workshops for people of color. So that Garrett Hongo was part of. Cool. Madeline, what about you? What's next steps for you?
Well, I think in terms of like my own personal next steps, it's definitely just a part. I found that I think this workshop, KIDD workshop, actually came into my life at a really good time for me because I had only taken, intro to poetry and other kind of like intro courses like that. So to really like dive deep into it and look at all the different types of poetry and just see how much was out there, I think it really just helped ground me in such a trying time. And I think as I just move forward and like transition from the, quarantine back to real life, like I think that poetry is just going to serve as something that I can come back to for the rest of my life and through my own, healing journey and everything. Like it'll be something to kind of hold on to and steady myself no matter what kind of happens next, I guess.
It can be your friend. Yes. Ava, what about you? What's next steps for your project in your life or in your writing?
I think I'm just gonna let it influence my writing and everything, because definitely like being able to deep dive into all those poets and everything, it is just so inspiring, and you get just so many ideas and everything. And actually, like I went into KIDD thinking I would never write poetry really, and like I was just kind of randomly here for a writing program, and now I like it a lot. So I think I'm just gonna keep writing poetry. So yeah.
I'm glad that the accident of fate has improved your life for the better. Cool. Yeah, I guess I'm just curious, in the last 5 minutes we have, like, how has your writing changed through the course of the KIDD? Because it's always interesting, when I read the applications to come in, and then seeing the anthology and how people change so much during that time. Like, how have you kind of tracked your own transformation? And we can start with Anna.
Yeah. I would just say overall, my confidence as a poet has completely just increased. Just the setting of workshop, but I also feel like all of us in the poetry sector of KIDD like is really like close and for the most part and really supportive and welcoming. And I just got this reassurance and kind of like all my imposter feelings about how I can write as a poet were completely thrown out the window. And even if I do go back to that space, I know I have this network of people that I can rely on. But in terms of writing, kind of similar to my LOI, I used to, like when I started writing poetry, it was very much in a journal sense. And then when I started having like academic settings with poetry, I was like, oh, I have to like replicate these kind of originals and these pioneers who are poets. And now I'm starting to realize that the whole idea of poetry for me is more of just like a form of catharsis, and that I've just kind of developed the tools to better my skills in representing myself more authentically. And so it kind of shifted from this idea of what it was supposed to be into like what it is for me, more just creatively, and I think just in skill level in general.
Cool. What about you, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's weird because I've always been very vulnerable with my writing. I think in my application I wrote about a specific family member, and then I just started writing more and more. But I was never confident about it. I was always like, this is like crap. And exploitation of my own trauma, but it's therapy, and it feels really good, and it's nice to know that I don't know, some people feel connected to it or supported by some of my writing, and it's made me very emotionally like aware of my writing and my intentions in the way that I write. So I'm glad I'm not just writing to write, that I'm a little more intentional of the way I write. I don't know, there's a little more of a structure for myself than just running amok in my room, grabbing pens and pencils and paper, but yeah.
And you become someone that can appreciate Ocean Vuong in this year, right? So that's good.
I'm not afraid anymore.
Yeah. What about you, Madeline?
Well, I totally agree with the whole imposter syndrome thing, because when I like got accepted, I was like, somebody made a mistake. They got the wrong Madeline. What? So like I go in and I'm like, all these people are genius. What am I doing here? And just basically that was me day one. And then me now, I just definitely, I feel much more like I have earned my way here, and that I am where I am because of my skills and what I have learned and accomplished throughout this year. And I think that compared, like my writing has definitely expanded. I have so many poems from like middle school where it was just all the same thing over and over. And then now I like look at what I've written just over this past year, and like every single thing that I've written is like something different. Well, for me anyway, I don't know about people who read my stuff, but to me it seems like it's all so different. And it's just so surprising to think that like, I could write this piece and then also write this piece and still be the same person. Like just realizing that there's so much more available to me than I gave myself credit for. I think that's really what I'm taking away most from this experience anyway. Yeah.
That sounds good. That's a good thing to know. Ava, what about you? How did you transform in this year?
Well, it only took being on Zoom calls with Lou like 5 times, being like, I barely know how to read, I can't write, to feel like I'm a writer. So that's good. But it's definitely been just a lot more like freeing, and I'm writing more about like how I actually feel instead of just like making up scenarios. And I also think being told that my poems are kind of psychotic and manic and crazy every single workshop has been empowering. So I'm definitely happy about that.
Yeah, it's definitely good to like have a response from someone instead of just like them falling asleep. So yeah, cool. All right, well, thank you so much for your presentations. They're all really fascinating, and I'm glad we got to hear them. And we also have our creative readers. Who's reading in the creative presentation next? So we got, okay, those people, great. So make sure at 3:30, that's right after the end of year reading, right? So we're all going to meet at 2:15 and then do the first creative reading at 3:30. And Andrew's now reading for the second one. So that's exciting. Glad that could work out. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you so much.
Bye.